The Authority is a comic book series that addresses a few specific questions. What would happen if the most powerful superheroes joined together and decided to be proactive rather than reactive? And what if they decided to address all threats, not just superpowered ones? The roots of the Authority began in the Image Comics title, Stormwatch. Stormwatch was an officially sanctioned United Nations task force that monitored and intervened in superhero activity around the world. The director of Stormwatch, Henry Bendix, was stationed on a satellite in high Earth orbit. He would assemble the appropriate team from the available operatives and put them into action when necessary. This was the basic premise of Stormwatch for the first 36 issues. Then, in 1996, Warren Ellis took over writing the title, and he began to shape the concept into the team that would eventually become the Authority. With his first issue, Ellis introduced Jenny Sparks and Jack Hawksmoor. Along with Swift, these three members would be the only members of Stormwatch to survive the abrupt transition to the Authority when it occurs. The first volume of Stormwatch concluded with the 50th issue. The final storyline, Change or Die, is an announcement that the series is about to dramatically change. Also, it's hard not to note that the covers take on a literal widescreen letterbox design to indicate an emphasis on big motion picture action and high concepts. When the series rebooted, it began to shed all its prior association with its Stormwatch roots. It progressively added more science fiction elements, such as the Bleed, which is the space between universes. Furthermore, it added characters such as Midnighter and Apollo. Along the same lines, Stormwatch also distanced itself from the house style seen in other Wildstorm series. The new, recurring artist, Bryan Hitch, used heavier lines and shadows and placed characters in a defined space. That is, he drew backgrounds with as much attention as the foreground characters. Visually, it's the difference between a sitcom filmed on a brightly lit stage and a drama that uses lighting to impact the mood of a scene. Finally, Hitch's style simply looked grounded. It had a quality that implied realism, or at the very least, a more realistic portrayal of a highly fantastical setting. The second series would only run 11 issues and one special. This special, Wildcats/Aliens, served to completely destroy the team, like literally. This crossover title was essentially forced onto Warren Ellis, so he used it as an opportunity to Stormwatch, and then to immediately get to the concept he was building towards, the Authority. At this point, it's worth mentioning that it's good to have the Stormwatch series as background information, but it's not necessary reading material to understand the Authority. In fact, when the Authority began, it was a hard reboot. It does almost nothing to fill in the gap between the end of Stormwatch and the beginning of this team. Suddenly, the Authority exist. They have the Carrier, a spaceship that navigates the Bleed, and all of the defining elements are in place. They can teleport easily, they communicate telepathically, and they're already functioning as a cohesive team ready to address worldwide threats. The first issue is practically a poster child for the popular literary term in media res, which translates into the middle of things. There's very little exposition, all the characters are fully developed, and a catastrophic threat suddenly appears to get the team's attention. This new series is also a tonal shift. The violence becomes more brutal, and the action sequences were entirely wordless, placing the continuity of events in the hands of the artist. Instead of unnecessary dialogue, sound effects, or overly written captions, the scenes were practically silent. It quickened the pace of these sequences, giving them an immediacy not ordinarily found in the medium. While this was not an entirely unique approach, scenes of silence are not uncommon. What made these scenes stand out is their length and frequency. This technique gave each sequence a distinct cinematic feel. While probably not intentional, this widescreen decompressed technique, as it's known nowadays, was also a stylistic transition. It bridged the gap between the earlier, highly rendered Image Comics content, which was empty of engaging stories and focused on artwork alone, to a place where the stories and the artwork finally complemented one another. The team included Stormwatch regulars Jack Hawksmoor, Jenny Sparks, and Swift. It also included Apollo and the Midnighter, who had been introduced during the second volume of Stormwatch. The new members were the Engineer and the Doctor. These members would be the core members that would appear in all future iterations of the team. As for the members themselves, the team is led by Jenny Sparks. She is your typical archetype that Warren Ellis uses for nearly every comic he's written. She's brash, overconfident, and is generally condescending to almost everyone. Her power is electricity-based, and she's referred to as the spirit of the 20th century. By the time the Authority begins, she is almost 100 years old, and the century is coming to a close, so you can guess her eventual fate. Jack Hawksmoor is a cross between a city empath and a symbiote. His powers fluctuate depending on the environment, and they are rather adaptable to the situation. When Jack was young, he was abused by people from the future who replaced his body parts with enhancements that draw power from metropolitan areas. So in big cities, Jack is overpowered and basically indestructible. Shen Li Men, also known as Swift, is a human with bird-like qualities. Mainly, she's just really fast. Unfortunately, her origin is rather pedestrian and very 90s. A comet passed by Earth, and that activated her recessive capabilities. Although, Jenny Sparks would give her an upgrade. Apollo and the Midnighter that are thinly disguised versions of Batman and Superman. Both are bioengineered individuals. The Midnighter can defeat any foe because his mind can accurately predict their moves before they make them. Apollo is charged by sunshine, and when fully charged, he is super powerful, fast, and, look, he's Superman in a different costume. The engineer is Angela Spica, who replaced all her blood with liquid nanotechnology. Essentially, she can morph into any shape, and she is the main interface between the team and their shift ship, the Carrier. The Doctor is a world shaman who is, conceptually, similar to the Swamp Thing. That is, he's chosen for the role and gets no training on how to use his abilities. However, he does receive guidance from all the doctors prior to him. So, while powerful, he doesn't really know what he's doing, which is his weakness, along with this version of the team is fully proactive. Unlike Stormwatch, they didn't ask for permission to intervene on anyone's behalf. They also delivered a very big brother message to the world. Be good, because we're watching, and if we don't like what we see, we'll come and kick your Warren Ellis would only stay on the title for 12 issues, delivering high-action, adventure stories. And in the final arc, he had the team destroy a science fiction version of It's this final story where Jenny Sparks, on the final day of the 20th century, sacrifices herself to save the planet. Once Ellis had finished with the series, the writer, Mark Millar, stepped in to take over. Millar's run on the title is probably best known for its edgy, controversial material, its noticeable delays, and the censorship it endured, not to mention the tone-perfect artwork by the artist Frank Whiteley. This collaboration worked well because it seemed like both creators had a particular distaste for the genre they were working within. Millar came out strong and established his voice immediately. In the first story arc, he established a Jack Kirby-inspired mad scientist as the villain, and then proceeded to have all of Kirby's famous characters act like psychopathic maniacs. To top it all off, in fact, although this action was heavily implied and censored from the dialogue. This version of the Authority seemed like it was carving a new, sadistic path in the superhero genre. It generated a lot of interest because, well, it was audacious. In retrospect, the material is mean-spirited, with ridiculous, straw man type of characters and gleeful. It intentionally tried to be shocking and distance itself from all superhero content. It was a spectacle with very little substance, but this approach seemed to connect with an audience. At this point, DC had purchased Wildstorm and established it as an imprint in their publishing line. While Wildstorm was technically its own entity, DC did enforce its own standards on the material. Notoriously, this led to an issue of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen being printed, recalled, and then destroyed due to an ad in that comic. However, this is practically a mild reaction compared to the censorship the Authority experienced. Side note: the following list of censored language and images apply to when the series was published during 2000 and 2002. In recent editions, DC has restored the language and artwork, so viewer discretion is advised. Early examples of censorship included toning down or slightly obscuring the violence, changing real-world locations and names, and an instance of the engineer. Originally, the Captain America stand-in, as well as the other Avengers members, were more obvious clones. However, this was toned down, and they were colored in very muted, generic tones to avoid being visual copies of their more colorful analogs. Reportedly, between Midnighter and Apollo was also censored, due to DC being uncomfortable with the implication that their direct analogs, Batman and Superman, might also be. Heavy censorship followed in what would be Millar's final story. It's often cited that the events of had a direct influence on the edited scenes, which may be somewhat true in spirit. However, it's more likely the distasteful nature of the story was what led to the wide variety of art and writing changes. What is known is that the one-shot, The Authority, widescreen, which was to take place in New York, was definitely cancelled due to. It may be this cancellation is conflated with the delays Millar's story experienced. The Brave New World arc, which started in issue 22, began with the artist, Frank Quitely. Reportedly, Quitely had drawn very little of the following issue before being replaced. Or quite possibly, he quit to work with Grant Morrison on the new X-Men. The circumstances of him leaving are not quite clear. Regardless, the first issue of that arc was published in March of 2001. The following issue, published 4 months later, began an entirely new story by an entirely new creative team, writer Tom Peyer and artist Dustin Nguyen. Technically, this fill-in story worked within continuity. That is, the Authority were attacked and destroyed in Brave New World, and a new version of the Authority was created to take their place. But, with hindsight, it seems apparent the story arc was an attempt to stall for time and make changes to Millar's story, or to find a replacement for Frank Quitely, or both. The second part of Brave New World wouldn't appear until January of 2002, and the subsequent final issues would have a 3-month delay between them. Its schedule was highly erratic. This was mostly due to the changes the new artist, Art Adams, needed to make. In fact, Adams would quit the title over these numerous changes, and the final issue of the story arc, which also turned out to be the final issue of the series, was drawn by Gary Erskine. As for the changes, issue 27 is the main focus. To begin with, a few instances of and an exposed were erased. The scene where the Colonel enters his room had a variety of posters removed. The following panel, which heavily implied he was about to was entirely redrawn. A mind-controlled Swift, who was established as a vegetarian, is forced to lick dirty. Then she kneels in a very provocative manner. This scene was redrawn and rewritten. Then current president was removed from one panel. This most certainly was a change made due to the events of the And finally, in the following issue, the execution of a character was changed to be far less explicit. It should be noted, these are all the known changes. Issue 27 bore the bulk of the censorship, having been written, approved, and drawn before someone decided the issue had crossed the line into distasteful territory. It's very easy to speculate that issues 28 and 29 had some heavy editorial input before the script was approved. Following issue 29, the Authority was unofficially cancelled. Abandoned may be a better way of putting it. Which wasn't too surprising from a publishing standpoint. It was controversial, experienced long delays, and had intense editorial scrutiny. Not to mention, by this time, Mark Millar had started writing Ultimate X-Men for Marvel, so his focus was definitely on the better-paying gig. At the same time, not continuing the series once Millar left was a slightly odd decision. After all, The Authority was a consistent selling title. In fact, its sales were rising. It went from roughly 32,000 copies for issue number 13 to just over 43,000 copies for its final issue. For comparison, it did as well as Batman in terms of sales. The Authority would be rebooted a year later, and it initially did well. But then it quickly shed readers, and it was cancelled with the 14th issue. So the momentum the original series had generated was lost, and the series never seemed to recover. Numerous reboots and miniseries would happen in the following years, some more successful than others, although it never again reached the high profile of the first influential volume. All that's left to say is, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, comment, and all that good stuff. Additional thanks to all those that directly support this channel and help keep the lights on. I appreciate every single one of you. Thank you.